The Far Cry games are some of the best open world action games and has been one of Ubisoft's biggest franchises for over 20 years now. These games, while some of them are absolute masterpieces, some of them aren't really, but they still are all special to me. So in this video I'm gonna rank them all from worst to best. And just to be clear before we start, I won't cover the console exclusive games like Vengeance and Instincts, and any DLC also won't be included as I will only rank the base games. And one other very important last thing before we start, this ranking is my opinion and I would love to hear yours down below, and while you're at it, drop a like and let me know what franchise I should rank next. The lowest game on this list is Far Cry New Dawn. I really wanted this game to be good, but it disappointed me in a lot of areas. New Dawn takes place in a post-apocalyptic Hope County after the events of Far Cry 5. And as much as I like me a post-apocalyptic setting like this one, New Dawn just misses the landing and the world isn't nearly as engaging as that of its prequel, as it is just a smaller part of that world, with the difference that it's just become a wasteland years after the nuke went off. And while I do like the look of this more wasteland version of Hope County, beyond that, the world is very shallow and really empty. New Dawn just doesn't do it for me, as it has a lot of the elements of Far Cry 5, but lacks most of the things that made that game so good. Like for example, the twins as villains don't really hit as much as some of the other villains in the franchise, as they aren't nearly as compelling as Joseph for example, and just act as any other cookie cutter standard villain throughout the game's short duration, which is also one of my biggest complaints about this game, as I do think it should have just been a DLC, as you can fly through the game in around 10 hours. New Dawn has the new addition of the superpowers, which in any other Far Cry game wouldn't really work, but it gives New Dawn some sort of way to differentiate it from the other games, which I do appreciate. Overall, this game had a lot of potential to be a great spin-off like some of the other spin-offs that I will get to later on, but it doesn't stick the landing. Next up is Far Cry 1. This is the game that feels the least like a Far Cry game, which is funny as it is the first game in the franchise, and you would think that it would start a trend of following games that are similar in style, but Far Cry 1 is very different in the sense that it starts off kind of similar to what you would expect from a modern Far Cry game, with you being dropped on an exotic island. And the game starts off really well, as the gameplay and gunplay is really fun, but the AI of the soldiers is actually pretty broken, as I have been killed through a tent more than I would like to admit, or have been absolutely sniped by them from across the map. But this is something I'm willing to forgive, as it brings in a way a challenge to the game that I kinda lacked in some of the other Far Cry games. And it was a fun way to approach the game, even if in some sections it was pretty frustrating. So my recommendation is not to go on a high difficulty setting, as the game is a little broken from time to time, and I didn't realize this until I was already way too deep into the game. But in the second half, the game really nosedives in quality with the introduction of the mutants. They are just full bullet sponges and are very boring to fight. And opposed to the strong start it had, it really doesn't go anywhere. One thing that did really surprise me though is just how good the game looked for it being over 20 years old now. While the world is closed off throughout the game, for a 2004 game, this is really impressive in how you can choose to go about taking on the missions and the different paths you take to get there. And somehow 20 years later, some of the design of this game can be found back in the most recent Far Cry games that have come out. After that, we move on to the most recent Far Cry game, Far Cry 6. This is what I like to define as the most 7 out of 10 game you can find. And that's because it doesn't do anything particularly wrong, but it also doesn't really do anything that really wows me, because the game always feels like it's playing super safe and doesn't want to take any big risks, unlike some of the other Far Cry games that specifically went out of their way to make the motivations of certain characters morally questionable and sometimes made you even question if what you were doing was the right thing. But this concept doesn't really exist in Far Cry 6. Take for example the villain Anton, played by the absolutely fantastic Giancarlo Esposito. Naturally, you would expect him to absolutely nail the role and be one of the best villains in the franchise. But while Esposito really puts a lot in this role, the game doesn't really give him much to work with, and he ends up being just okay but not that memorable, because his character is pretty one-note and doesn't evolve or ever makes you question your decisions throughout the game. The rest of the side villains are plain boring in my opinion, and they don't add anything to the story, as they are just some military leaders with nothing interesting about them and no reason for them to exist other than just padding out the game, and they all pair in comparison to some of the other side villains in the franchise that actually had a reason to be in the game and contribute to the overall plot of the game. On the other hand, bringing back a talking protagonist is one of the major plus points that I have for Far Cry 6 and brings you a lot closer to the events and the people in the game. So even if I do prefer some of the other main protagonists in the other games, it's great to have a talking protagonist again. The world of Yara is pretty immersive, and I like a lot of side activities in the game, and the outposts around the world are really fun and expansive. And while it's not my favorite, I enjoyed my time in Yara. Far Cry 6 falls in the category of the more recent Ubisoft projects that pad out the game as much as they can, and it really shows in this game, as it just keeps dragging on and drip feeding you the story just enough to keep you playing, but the pace is not up to par in my opinion. And on top of that, my biggest complaint of this game is that it's just too easy. It doesn't have any difficulty, as when you equip a weapon with a suppressor and armor piercing bullets, you can walk up to just about anyone and one tap them in the head and get away with it. All this bundled up with a drawn out length just ends up hurting the game and making it kinda boring after a while, as you can just cruise through the game and don't really have to worry about dying all that much, which is a super big step in the wrong direction for the franchise in my opinion. This next game is very different from all the other games in the franchise, and that is Far Cry Blood Dragon. From here on out, all the games are absolutely fantastic and games I have come back to in my free time so often. Blood Dragon takes place in the dystopian 2007 through the lens of 1980s sci-fi movies and how they portray the future, and this brings a really unique over-the-top vibe that is really lighthearted but insanely fun. The tone of Blood Dragon is very absurd, but it knows that and uses it to its strengths and is full of self-aware jokes and humor. So even if the story is very basic, it doesn't really need to be more than it is, as it doesn't even take itself seriously. So why would you ever take it seriously? You play as Sergeant Rex, who makes you feel like you are playing as a Terminator himself, with the sheer amount of different guns and gadgets you get at your disposal, which allows you to run into a base and just blast everyone. But the stealth that Far Cry is known for is still here and is even expanded upon with the chain assassinations, for example, that allow you to take down multiple targets with a single takedown and make going the stealth route a good option as well. But come on, who needs stealth if you can just run it down and blast your way through an entire enemy base? Blood Dragon's biggest addition is of course the Blood Dragons themselves, that roam the open world and can be your biggest threat or biggest ally, as you can trick them into fighting your enemies, or they can turn on you and try to kill you. So you have to strategically use them or try to avoid them. I think they are a fun addition to spice up the gameplay, and in this game they work quite well and don't overstay their welcome, while in a longer game they might have. I think Blood Dragon, while not being the most intricate game, is a very fun one and will always have a special place in my heart. Coming in the number 5 spot is Far Cry 5. This might be a little controversial, but I think Far Cry 5 is on the verge of being a masterpiece. It had the potential to be one of the greatest in the franchise, but misses out on being in that category just by a hair. I truly think this game is great. I love the setting of an American county overthrown by a maniac cult. This cult is led by the Seed family, who all bring a different sort of personification of torture to the table. The world itself is also a major compliment I have for the game, as the rural American countryside setting sets it apart from all the other Far Cry games and feels very authentic, as it is made with a lot of attention to detail and immersed me from start to finish, as it is just so fun to roam around in this world and everything feels really natural. The game looks and feels great, and while it doesn't innovate the most coming from Far Cry 4, I think the game is fun enough to stand on its own legs and refines the systems that were already in place from the previous games. One thing a lot of people don't really like in this game is the forced kidnapping scenes, and I have to be honest here, I don't mind them. It's not something I would love in every game, but here it kinda makes sense in my opinion. It keeps you on your toes when you are doing missions, and especially in my first playthrough I was so confused to be randomly kidnapped out of nowhere. And these scenes leads us to the Seed family. I do think they are up there with some of the best villains in the franchise. While Joseph is the main antagonist, I do also really like John and Faith, as they both bring their unique ways of torturing and manipulating you, and they all made a lasting impact on me. But my favorite villain in this game has to be Jacob. This guy just completely steals the show in my opinion, and the way he manipulates you into becoming his puppet and doing his bidding without you even knowing, and all of this being done through gameplay sequences in a way that no other way of storytelling could achieve, is just masterful. But I said before that Far Cry 5 was on the verge of being a masterpiece, and this is mainly because of one thing that in my opinion doesn't really sit that well with me, and that is the ending, where Joseph drops a nuke, and while it is heavily insinuated upon, I really just dislike this ending and it left me quite disappointed. But if I do look past that, this game is great and the next games are even better, which leads us to Far Cry 2. This game has grown on me quite a lot over the years, and I think it has to a lot of other people as well, as it used to be one of the most hated games in the franchise and has evolved over the years into one of the most praised games. This is the real first Far Cry game in my opinion, as it lays down all the foundations that the following games all build upon in a more significant way than what Far Cry 1 started off with. But the main reason why Far Cry 2 started off being as hated as it was is that it has quite a depressing vibe that is totally intentional, and some of the gameplay mechanics are specifically designed to make you feel worse, to really immerse you into the world and to make you feel how the character you're playing as would actually feel. While for some this can be tedious and annoying, with in particular the malaria pills you have to keep getting over and over again, I personally think it's pretty immersive and a unique way to make you fear for your safety throughout the game. Another thing I really like is the gun degradation system that Far Cry 2 implements, that requires you to keep track of the state that your weapon is in. As the worse the quality of your weapon gets, the bigger the chances are that it will jam when you try to use it, so you have to keep your weapons maintained or it might actually get you killed if you aren't being careful. But the thing I love the most about this game is the way it uses the compass and handheld map to navigate the open world. As while you are in a car, you have this small GPS that indicates where you need to go and not just some random objective marker that the newer games have. This all adds to the atmosphere that the game tries to achieve and makes you feel really immersed in a way that some of the more recent games don't even bother with anymore. While I do have a lot of positive things to say about Far Cry 2, it is not perfect in any sense, as the missions in the game are really bare bones and do become a little tedious after some time, as most of them are just accept mission, drive to your destination, fix your car, shoot the guy, drive back and pop some pills. And in the open world itself there isn't really that much to do apart from just completing your missions. But overall Far Cry 2 brings this all together in a masterpiece of a game and paves the way for all the next games to refine this formula it introduced. But before we make it to the top 3, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and want to see me rank some other franchises in the future. So don't forget to let me know in the comments what I should rank next. Far Cry Primal is by far the best spin-off game in my opinion and has a special place in my heart. It takes place in 10,000 BCE and really commits itself to immersing you in this ancient world that is super dangerous to roam around in, as it is overrun by apex predators that will kill you in 1 or 2 hits, and you have to carefully plan how to take them out without them getting you first, or you have to sneak past them if you don't think you can kill them. The hunting and gathering mechanics that are in place in Primal are excellent too, as they are required throughout the entire game to craft arrows, clubs and other things, but they are very seamless and don't feel tedious at all, as almost all of the gathering animations are very short and give you just the right amount of resources to feel satisfying. I do also recommend trying the game on permadeath mode, as it takes the immersion up to the next level and really drives home the point that in this world you are the prey and not the hunter, and you need to be careful about every action you take, as all of them can result in a game over. Another thing I think Primal absolutely nails is the village mechanics. Basically you keep finding people to send to your village when you complete quests throughout the world, and you keep expanding your village to get more power-ups, and you can also expand your skill tree by upgrading huts of specific characters. I think these mechanics are really fun and give a big incentive to keep exploring, and they bring another way of rewarding you for actually doing things like side quests and random encounters. Another nice touch in Primal is that the characters themselves don't speak English, but instead an ancient language, and they also communicate with very simple things, and they rarely speak to each other in entire sentences, but rather they keep it short as they would in that time. I personally love this way more than the over-explaining dialogue that some of the other games have. This same thing goes for the story of Primal. It keeps it simple and doesn't even try to pretend that it is deeper than it actually is, which is a perfect way to have a story for a shorter spin-off game. I have always loved Primal, but coming back to it for this video made me appreciate it even more and made me fall in love with it again. Coming in at second place is Far Cry 4. This game had a lot to live up to, and in most parts it actually delivered, and while it wasn't as revolutionary compared to its predecessor, it actually took a lot of the great parts of Far Cry 3 and streamlined them to modernize the formula. The major difference between 3 and 4, and my biggest complaint in Far Cry 4, is the main protagonist. And while he is still fully voiced, unlike in Far Cry 5, it really doesn't come close to a Jason from Far Cry 3, but I guess that's not an easy feat, as the bar was set at the highest it could have ever been. All the comparing to Far Cry 3 aside, Far Cry 4 still has all the elements to a fantastic game. The world of Kyrat is absolutely stunning, and I would even say that it is my favorite setting in the franchise, as I absolutely adore the Himalayan mountains and the aesthetic it brings to the table, as it is absolutely breathtaking, and I love the more vertical landscapes it has. Far Cry 4 introduces the karma system that influences some of the relationships relationships with the rebels, and it also has some minor story outcomes, but it doesn't really influence the game in a significant way. But I like it, and it is a fun addition to the game to add some more immersion of the world and the characters that live in it. But at the center of it all is the conflict between the rebels and the tyrant Pagan, who is one of my favorite villains, as he is really charismatic in his own messed up ways, and throughout the game he is always present. Even when he is off screen, you can still feel his presence and influence on the world. This really emphasizes the conflict and immerses you fully into the world and the stakes at hand. Gameplay wise, Far Cry 4 still has all the elements to make a great Far Cry game. The gameplay is still very fun and feels very fluid. Overall, Far Cry 4 is absolutely fantastic and it all just works. But coming in at first place, you guessed it, it's Far Cry 3. I have a lot of things to praise about this game, but also a few things that I think it lacks. But let's start with the great things, as the first thing that probably comes to your mind, and mine too, is Vaz. This guy just steals the show, and it really shows, as once he's out of the story, the game does dip in quality, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. Vaz just grabs your attention from the very first moment he shows up, and he never lets it go. But it's actually funny just how little he's actually in the game, as his screen time is only about a total of just over 8 minutes, but he is still considered by a lot of people, and myself too, as the best villain in the franchise. And all of this is because of the absolutely terrific performance of Michael Mando, as he completely disappears in this role, and to think that originally he wasn't even going to be in this game is just unimaginable at this point. But Vaz aside, I think the best portrayed character in Far Cry 3 has to be Jason, the character that you, the player, play as. The slow descent from frat boy into full-on Terminator that you in real time experience in this game is just breathtaking, and by far the best storyline in the Far Cry franchise, and the way this gets done through gameplay is just fantastic. But even beyond the story, Far Cry 3 is insanely fun, as it builds upon the core systems of Far Cry 2 and expands them in so many different ways, with for example the skill tree and the removal of some of the more realistic features like the gun degradation to fit the less depressing setting. But I did say at the start that I do have some complaints about the game. The main one being that once Vaz is killed, the game drops in quality in terms of the narrative, as Hoyt doesn't nearly hit the same and just exists in the shadow of Vaz. One other nitpick I have with the game is that the exploration really isn't as exciting or rewarding as I remember it being. And a lot of the rewards for exploring just feel like filler content that you weren't supposed to go out of your way for. But at the end of the day, Far Cry 3 is one of my favorite games of all time and a real masterclass in storytelling through gameplay. If you did enjoy this video, you will love this next video on the screen right now.